Well, the nation has been focused on train derailments and railway safety of late in the wake of last month's toxic derailment of a Norfolk Southern train in East Palestine, Ohio, as well as other derailments across the country since then. We reached out to the Minot Railroad Museum to see if there's been a spike in interest in the history of derailments. Golden Melland, the museum's president, says less dramatic train derailments happen every day. Mellon says the amount of people who visit is a hit and miss, and it's not necessarily about railway safety. While they have numbers on derailments, he says the museum teaches the history of towns connected to the railway.
People that work for the railroad actually got the museum started, and for their history and saving their history and talking about the history, minus the railroad town.
They are open 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Saturdays, and they are run by volunteers.